Welcome to Enough Rope. You know my first guest well, or you think you do. You saw him change the nature of current affairs television, providing many unforgettable moments along the way. You followed his ups and downs in the business pages, at awards nights, and through the gossip columns. But you probably don't know just how profoundly he's changed in the last 10 years, making an extraordinary journey from great sceptic to that of a man who believes in miracles, a man determined to prove that the blood of Jesus Christ still exists today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Willesee. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Andrew.
You've been off our screens for a while, but you've been involved in another passion, a deeper passion. Can we go back to that incident in Africa, I think about 8 years ago, which took you back towards God? What happened?
It wasn't actually a defining moment, but it was pretty extraordinary nonetheless. I was sitting with cameraman producer Greg Lowe, who I worked a lot with, and we were going up into the Sudan. And I had this very strong premonition, so strong as, I believed it was going to happen. This plane is going to crash. And I didn't believe in premonitions. And I thought, what do I do about this? What do I say to Greg? He's going to think I've lost it, I've lost my nerve or whatever. So I thought, well, that's it, we're going to crash. So I stayed on the plane. But I said a prayer, which was unusual for me. I had been thinking about, I'd got to the stage of thinking, what's it all about? But I hadn't done anything about it. But I did say, believing the plane was going to crash, okay, Father, I put Greg and myself in your hands. We took off and flew for a little while, and the plane fell out of the air. And the only thought that occurred to me was, yep, I was right. Didn't give me a lot of comfort, but no. We knocked down a couple of hundred trees. We flew over it later that morning, and it was quite sensational. And the plane was written off. If ever there was going to be an instant conversion, maybe that should have been it, but it wasn't. I did have the decency to then thank God and then forgot about him again.
You said that you'd been thinking a bit about God before that. What had you believed in up to that point?
Well, nothing. It's a pretty classic case, really, of getting caught up with the world. I got caught up in always competing. Every day was competitive for me. There was always a new program to beat, or a new guy to beat, or some new challenge. And who needed God?
When you were a kid, or when you were at school, you actually had flirted with the idea of being a priest, didn't you? What became of that? Puberty. Started thinking about girls, and I realised the two were incompatible. You wanted other people in frocks.
Yeah, I sure did.
Because I want to step through a bit of your career for people to get some sense of the world you moved in, who you were. We've got some footage here from your Logie's Hall of Fame sort of biography, which is you when you first were at the ABC. I think you were only about 20 years old. This is a very young Mike Willesee. What kind of man was that young man?
Terrified. I'd overachieved at that stage. I got there pretty quickly, and I was quite young. I was about 24, I think, then. I'd been to Vietnam with my old paper, the Perth Daily News, which set me alight as a journalist. I just never knew excitement or adrenaline like it, or the importance of covering, such importance of getting things right, of trying to understand what you didn't understand and so on. And then I came back to Canberra, and I called my editor in Perth and said, I'm back. And he said, so what? So I looked around and found television, and by coincidence they were starting a program called This Day Tonight, which was brand new and turned out to be very successful. And unknown to me, while I was thinking about television, they'd auditioned some journalists and hadn't found a suitable guy, one who could handle television and knew a bit about politics. And I got the job. And I was suddenly political correspondent on a national program, And I was the man, like I was like Laurie Oakes, but I was 24 and knew very, very little. And so rather than be ambitious and competitive at that time, I was quite terrified.
We've got some footage here of you in full flight. Michael Willesee is part of our television furniture, but some may not remember the vast scope of his work when he left the ABC, went to commercial television with A Current Affair and Willesee. This is also from his Logie Hall of Fame induction. Now, I don't want you to be modest. This is a genuine professional question. When you were at your best, what made you good?
Quite seriously, I think I did more research and preparation than any of the other guys. I mean, that Houston interview, for example, is a classic example. You know, I spent about 2 days preparing for that, and I had a researcher assisting me, and he gave me a list of questions, and I used to say to him, please don't give me questions without reasons. So I went to him and I said, what's this question about the birthday cake? And he said, I don't know. I said, oh, that just makes it hard for me, you know. I mean, I don't have a lot of time, and you've stuck me with this question. And I can't just dismiss it because I've got a feeling that there's a reason for it. And he said, well, I don't know what it is. So I sat down and thought about it, and I thought, well, what if I was asked the question and I was in his position? Would there be GST on a birthday cake? What is a birthday cake? It's a cake, but then it has artwork on it. That's different. It would be treated differently from a basic foodstuff, such as a basic cake. It has candles. That's something different altogether. It might have cream and chocolate in it, which is a luxury. But this is a really good question. But I had to sort of work it out. So it wasn't just an off-the-wall question. But, yeah, I researched very heavily, and I would anticipate the answers and what I would do if I was in trouble. And I don't think I ever was in a position that I couldn't get out of when they came back at you. And a lot of those guys did come back at you. But I don't think I was ever in a position where I couldn't justify the question or come back with a response because the homework was there.
When you look at commercial current affairs shows today, what's your view on their standard?
I really don't want to be a critic. You know, don't you think we have enough?
Well, you don't have to be a critic. I mean, you of all people are in a position to comment. You've been there, done that many times over.
Well, to be honest, I don't watch them unless one of the promotions catches my eye and I think I want to watch that story. Because they've become much more magazine, which is not my sort of journalism, so I don't want to be a critic of them. They must know what they're doing, they have the ratings, they know who their audience is, and they're meeting that audience, but in a very different way and in a way that doesn't really interest me.
Mm. Do you have any advice for Eddie?
Yeah, his first mistake was Collingwood.
Spoken like a Swans man.
I think he's in a difficult position because the whole culture at Channel 9 has changed, and they've lost, you know, one of the great television brains in the world in Kerry Packer. And Kerry, while being the smartest, was also smart enough to let Channel 9 run itself, whereas now it seems there's a huge crossover between the Packer empire and the 9 network. Well, I haven't seen any reason to believe that Eddie has the control that David Leckie had or Sam Chisholm before him. You know, I think he's part of a much bigger team, so it's very hard to give him advice. He's part of a team, and I don't quite know where he slots into that team.
Well, by the late 80s, you'd made a considerable amount of money, somewhere in excess of $50 million, and you, I think you were the owner of the Swans for a while, Sydney radio station, Today FM, thoroughbred racing, property investment, none of which were really low-risk investments. What was the thing that drew you? Was it the money? Was it the competition? Was it the gamble?
Yeah, I never did anything just for money. It was always the challenge, or because I wanted to do it, or because someone needed a hand.
The reason I asked you about was it also the gamble that you liked? You were very keen on gambling.
Yes, loved gambling. For
a long time.
Yeah.
There were stories that you had to sell properties to pay back a multi-million-dollar gambling debt. Did it get to that extent?
There were two stories. One was that I won a lot of money, and one was that I lost a lot of money. Both stories were incorrect in their detail, and both stories cancelled each other out.
Are either stories substantially true?
Both were largely true. I did have a big win at one time. I did have a big loss at one time. But they were both quite incorrect in the detail.
Gambling can become quite obsessive for people. Did it become a thing that you went for too much?
Probably, but fortunately I never gambled for long periods. I think it was, when I wanted a little bit of excitement, go to the edge. I mean, I did it by deliberately going to war zones also, because, I did the one thing for about 20 years straight, sitting behind the desk 5 nights a week. At times you get very tired and bored. You start doing stories and you think, haven't we done this story before? I think just the names have changed, And I think, oh, this is bad, this is really, if you get stale, you're in trouble. And I would deliberately find an excuse to go and do something exciting. And gambling was one of those things, finding exciting stories, going into war zones. And in war zones, I'd always go to the edge, If there was trouble somewhere, I'd go, you could pick the journalists. Half the journalists would go towards the action, the other half would go to the press conferences.
You talked before about it began to have, later in your career, had this goldfish bowl effect. You were going round and round and round. And this was at a time when you had also made a lot of money. Was God on your mind at any of this time, or was basically this still all about Mike?
It was when I had not enough to do that I had a really flat spot in my life. It was because I'd been so busy, which I don't complain about. It was great. I think I was born to be busy, and that's I got sick of that, and I thought, I don't need to do this anymore. I've got nothing more to prove. But after those challenges went, then I kept looking for the combative stories or the going to the edge sort of stuff, and I thought, well, why sit behind a desk? Why pretend anymore? And Nine bought me out, which seemed a good idea at the time because it sort of wasn't working, and it was a lot of money to pay me out, even though the money didn't really interest me. And then I suddenly had nothing to do. I had time to stop and think. And, then I got around to thinking about why we're here. Am I really just going to die and things stop? That would make everything so pointless. And I tried hard to do some good things. I think on balance I was more of a good man than a bad man. I had a good sense of justice and social welfare and protecting the underdog and so on. But yeah, I was selfish in my personal life. Apart from my children, I looked after myself, and there are a lot of things that I did that I wouldn't do if I had the views that I now hold.
Can I just take you back one before we get on to the real conversion for you, which was your state of mind towards the end of your time on A Current Affair? And first of all, that sort of infamous incident where you appeared on A Current Affair, you were filling in for Jana, and you were drunk. In fact, I think the next night Darren Hench went on air and said, "I'm Darren Hench and I'm sober."
Yeah.
When you look back...
I'm not sure he was telling the truth.
I'm not sure anyone cared. When you look back on that now, do you see a man lost?
Yes, I think that's pretty fair. And the problem with being lost is not just being lost, but not knowing that you're lost. If you know you're lost, you can do something about it. I didn't know I was lost because everything had worked for me. I guess I had a golden touch. Whatever I did seemed to work. As you rightfully pointed out, that night I was filling in. I'd been doing nothing. And life wasn't a lot of fun. This was the time I should have had fun because, I could fly anywhere I wanted, I could have a holiday anywhere I wanted, I could afford whatever I wanted, but it didn't seem to be, it was much more fun when I was working. But I got bored with that, so it wasn't, maybe that plane crash, maybe that was a jolt. It wasn't a conversion, but, maybe that really kicked me into saying, well, wait a minute, are coincidences coincidences? The more I thought about God, the more, at the very least, I had something to think about.
There's one last thing from your career, speaking of state of mind, which was probably the thing you were most criticised for, which was the Cangai siege. Now, this was 4 years after the incident of being drunk on air, and there were 2 young children that had been taken by 3 armed men who who'd killed some people. They were in a farmhouse, and you were able to get a line through to them.
Yep.
This is a little bit of the footage of an interview which attracted a lot of criticism afterwards for Mike. Now, as you said, you believed yourself to be a fair man and that you acted well, yet you copped enormous criticism for that as being a lapse of judgment, putting those children into a situation of further psychological distress. Again, when you look back on that, do you have a sense of somebody who was so used to competing that the moral compass had gone astray?
No, I don't. And I reject all but one part of the criticism. I was wrong to ask the little girl if she'd seen Leonard do anything bad. That was a mistake. And this is not an excuse. However, the circumstances were that I was driving to work and I got a call in the car saying, we have them on the line, and he said he'll wait to talk to you. I was thinking very fast. I was driving very fast through traffic, and I literally drove my car into the studio, jumped out of my car, went to the desk, and started that interview. That's not an excuse. I made a mistake. But far more importantly was that my only concern, and the only thing I had in my mind, these guys are not just killers, they're actively killing. They killed yesterday and the day before and maybe the day before that. And these two children are in there. And the fact that the guy stayed waiting on the phone for me, I thought, he must think something of me or want, I don't know, the fame of being on this television program. You know, I've got to use whatever advantage I have here. I've got to get these kids out. And so that looks bad. I mean, that's really taking out of context a very long interview. Most of the time I spent talking with him. And I got him on the phone and I said, Leonard, I'm going to ask you a favour. And he said, what is it? I said, I want you to let those kids go. He said, OK, I will. I said, no, I want you to let them go now. And he said, oh, all right, I will. And he did. Now, all that criticism is theoretical, that I should have got off the phone and let someone else have a go. Now, this guy hated police officers, and they wanted police officers on the phone to him. The fact is, I got those kids out. They're alive today, and their parents have thanked me. Of course, I wouldn't ask that question again, knowing the mistake and having time to think about it. But I got the kids out. The other people were hypothesising they would have got them out.
Again, that self-belief, that confidence in yourself.
I had a determination to get those kids out.
I mean, that's over 12 years ago. I can hear it in your voice. You're still quite stirred up about that, aren't you?
They were in a really dangerous situation.
You stepped away from regular current affairs television later that year, and you were 50. And as you said, you'd been everywhere, done everything, and you started to think about the universe and about bigger things. It was a few years later that you met your wife, Gordana. What sort of change did she bring into your life?
Again, this word coincidence. You know, why did I meet Gordana, who I'd known before? We'd worked together, but Gordana's much younger than me, and when I first met her, I thought she was fantastic, but a little young for me. Okay, me a little old for her. But we met again, 7 or 8 years later, and the difference, didn't seem so much. And she rescued me at a Logies party, actually. Someone was harassing me, and she came over and helped me out. And I asked her if she'd like to have lunch the next day. And then I said, would you like to go out, one night in Sydney? And I went to her house, and her flat, very small, tiny flat. And I remember there was a large picture of the Last Supper on the wall. And then on the other wall there was a picture of the Virgin Mary. There were a few other relics and holy pictures and so on. I said, what do people say when they come into your flat and see all this religious stuff? She said, I don't care. Well, that's pretty good, So at the time in my life when I was thinking about God and had a bit of a wake-up call with the plane crash, I met Gordana, who had strong faith. Maybe it was about that time I started thinking about this word coincidence being a word that doesn't really apply.
It was after you met Gordana that you had your first confession. not directly after, but sometime after, your first confession, I think, in 30 years, which, considering the life you'd led, must have been tag team priests. What was the experience like?
Well, there is a God. He proved it that night because he stepped in and saved me. Because I'd got to the stage where I knew God was there, apart from having some rational reasons to believe it. I mean, you can't get faith rationally. You can't read the right books and think it through and say, therefore there is God, and he's a God of love and mercy, therefore I will love him in return. That's it. It doesn't happen like that. Faith is a gift. And I'd gone past that stage. I had the rational belief that God was there by proving some supernatural things to be true, by reading the writings of this woman, Catalina Rivas, by seeing a stigmata, which was seeing the wounds of Christ reenacted. I mean, I had all the reasons you needed to believe in God, but somehow that wasn't my conversion. My conversion was a gift. It was inside me, and I knew I believed in God and I wanted him. But I didn't have the courage to take the next step and say, well, I'm already a Catholic, I'm baptised, but I've got to go to confession. And as you rightly say, over 30 years or so, the life I led, you do accumulate a bit of a track record. And I didn't even confront it in my own mind. I was just, putting it off. And I bought a hotel in North Sydney and had built some offices above for our own use. I built a restaurant below. And Cardia came out to Australia, accompanied by her spiritual director, a beautiful Italian priest named Father Renzo Cecilo. And just as the main course was being served, Father Renzo, who didn't speak very good English, said, your offices are here. And I said, yes, they're up here, Father. And he said, are they blessed? And I had to stop from laughing because I thought, I'm not blessed, the thought of having my offices blessed just seemed odd, but I kept a straight face and said, no, Father, they're not. He said, would you like them blessed? And out of politeness, I didn't even really, I'd never thought of such a thing as having your offices blessed. So I politely said, yes, Father, I would. So he stood up. It's okay. I started walking out. And we went upstairs, and I don't know why, but halfway up the stairs I said, Padre, one day I would like to talk to you, not do, talk. One day, talk about confession. Long way away, talk, just have a chat, friendly chat, maybe when we meet in another country, in another decade.
Another life, perhaps, yes.
No. And he didn't answer me. And I thought, this doesn't make sense. Maybe it's his English. His English wasn't very good. And he was ignoring me, and he looked into the smallest place, which was the little kitchen area. He said, what is this? And I said, I think, Father's losing the plot here. I said, it's a kitchen, Father, Padre, it's where we make the coffee. He took me by the arm and walked in and blessed me and started the confessional ride. And I went so close to saying, no, you don't understand. Let's talk about it. But the next thing, I was confessing and crying, and there was 30 years just falling out, spilling out, gushing out.
How did you feel after?
Weightless. Like this load was gone, and it was a very, very beautiful and profound moment. And Cardia was leaning over the couch in the reception area praying. And she stood up and she was crying, and we were all crying. And she reached into her dress and pulled out a holy card and gave it to me. And it was perfectly crisp and fresh, not like you'd even put it in your pocket, let alone in your dress. And it was a picture of Christ hugging the prodigal son. And she couldn't have known by any normal means that I was going to have confession that night. Because if you had asked me if I was going to have confession that night, I would have given you a written guarantee, and being a betting man, offered you a shade of odds, there will be no confession tonight.
Let's talk about Catalina Rivas. For those that are unfamiliar with the story, Mike travelled to Bolivia at the invitation of his neighbour, Ron Tesoriero, to meet a woman who had stigmata, and he ended up making a documentary about it called Signs from God, which was seen in America by an audience of some 20 million. Here's an excerpt from that. What was that experience like for you?
Very, very moving. A little bit frightening, a little bit hard to deal with. I hadn't converted at that time, remember. I was still trying to investigate. It was very difficult to be an investigator and go through, this huge life change at the same time yourself. So maybe it was particularly difficult for me because I was trying to be objective. I was taking the blood because we were testing everything. My attitude was, my opinion doesn't count for anything. I've got to test everything that I see. And yet we saw her, over the 3-hour period, deteriorate in her health. The wounds didn't look that serious. They were open wounds. They did appear naturally. There's no possible way they were self-inflicted or put there by anybody else. I mean, we had 2 cameras rolling and 10 witnesses, and I was feet away from her. And then her health deteriorated to the stage in the last minutes, the last 5 to 10 minutes of the 3-hour period. It stopped at 3 o'clock, and it's believed that Jesus died at 3 o'clock. Her lungs seemed to be filling with a liquid. She seemed to be drowning. And 2 women were lifting her up to help her breathe, and her eyes were rolling back. If you didn't know what was happening, you would say, I'm watching a woman die. By that night, the wounds started to heal, some of them completely. And by the next day, all the wounds had disappeared, except for those on the top of her feet. But they were completely healed. But there were marks there. But when you felt them, they were completely smooth.
There was no possibility that she had cut herself in some way?
I don't believe there was any possibility. I mean, master magicians can do things that really fool you, but it's hard to fool a camera. And magicians use movement, illusion, and distraction. She didn't use any of those. She was lying still. Certainly no one jumped between me and her and did it.
You went there to test it, and you went there as a questioning man. Did you look at all possible alternatives? The British Medical Journal, for instance, had examined stigmata and had talked about a thing called Gardner-Diamond syndrome, where people in a highly emotional state can will themselves to bleed as an explanation for stigmata.
Yes.
Did you look at that?
Yes. Yes, and talked to a number of psychiatrists about it, who said they'd read of similar things and heard of similar things, and we were even approached by people who said, we know of people who can do this. To each one I said, please find one of these people for me and we'll do the same tests. Nobody has ever produced anybody. But the second question I put to all these, especially the psychiatrists, anyone from the medical field, I said, okay, in those tests, could those people then heal their own wounds within hours? The answer was, we have no evidence of that ever happening.
This has gone much deeper for you now. You're on the trail of a great detective story, really, which is to try and prove the existence of the blood of Jesus Christ, that it still exists. How do you prove that?
We started thinking about the blood of Christ because there's the shroud which wrapped the body of Christ, which has blood on it. It has been, parts of it have been examined. It's type AB. There's the sedarium, which is a very little known cloth which covered the face of Jesus, which also has blood on it. We found that in a place called Oviedo in Spain. That blood's been tested, and it's AB also. If you take pictures of the two, the small cloth only covered part of Jesus' head while he was still on the cross, so it doesn't go all the way around. But if you take that part, which coincides with the same part of the shroud which covered all of his body, there are more than 120 wounds of coincidence when you put the two pictures one over the other. So there's a very strong case already to say that these two cloths were the two cloths mentioned in John's Gospel. So we thought, well, if the blood's there and science is advancing, why don't we take the same scientific approach, and instead of people arguing about the story of Christianity and the story of Jesus Christ, if the shroud is true and the Sudarium is true, then that gives a very strong rational basis for believing the whole story, and gives a much stronger argument for believing the resurrection, that Christ rose from the dead.
You have scientific challenges ahead of you, though. There are questions over the age of the Shroud of Turin. Nature magazine tested it and said it dated back to medieval times, somewhere in the 13th century.
Yeah, that's been completely discounted.
Though they stand by, it was discounted, and then they stood by their findings. Well, so that's in dispute still.
I've been to a number of conferences where scientists from different disciplines get together. They don't even discuss that anymore. In fact, one guy summarised one conference. He was the leading academic scientist there. And he said it would be a greater miracle if it were a 13th century fraud than if it were the real story, because we have the greatest artist of all time and no one even knows his name. However, that was carbon dating, and all the scientists who've worked on it since from different disciplines say it's just incorrect. And many scientists have done other tests and say, well, we can't say, therefore, that the shroud is authentic. Nobody can say it's authentic, but it is of about the right age.
The bigger problem you face, of course, is the ability of science to prove these things, because, and I'm sure you've talked with DNA experts, you know that blood degrades over time, that DNA degrades over time, and there's a real question as to whether, this being 2,000 years old, it's a contaminated sample or not, because many people have handled it.
The contamination is extreme. We've done a lot of work on this, for the last 6 or 7 years.
You're going to end up hosting a forensic show. I can see the angle here, Mike Willesee.
Current DNA protocols don't allow them to extract and profile degraded DNA. We believe that with the natural progression of science that they will be able to do this. We're working with one very brilliant scientist who was actually rebuilding damaged DNA. He'd got up to rebuilding 200 pairs. I won't try and explain all that, but it's about 20% of what you need to say this blood or this matter comes from the same person.
However, sorry to interrupt, but even the human body, when it replicates DNA, seldom does it perfectly. Don't these various hurdles cast into doubt your ability to prove what it is you're trying to prove?
Yes, definitely. No guarantee at all that science will ever be able to put together that seriously damaged DNA. But in pursuing this part of the detective story, we have found several other mysteries which science can't explain. But you're going to have to wait for the book.
Oh, come on. You can't leave us with a cliffhanger like that.
But if I tell you the main bits of the book, you're not going to buy it. And, I've got 7 children.
Hang on, that's all. You're down to your last 50 million, I know.
We have discovered a couple of mysteries which requires more work.
Can you give us one?
I can tell you that from 2 of our samples, we've gone to a number of scientists who have found no results at all and say that in itself is inexplicable.
Sorry, what do you mean, no results at all?
No results.
From?
For looking for DNA, even damaged, degraded DNA, they will find something. So it's led us on another trail, and even with your great powers of persuasion, I'm not taking you down that trail any further, but it's fascinating. More importantly, we have a positive result of 2 samples that are 1,300 years apart. And that also, you must read the book first. But I won't be mean, I'll send you a copy.
Isn't the point of faith, though, that it shouldn't have to be proved? Isn't faith enough?
Exactly. That hasn't worked.
Says who?
The statistics. In this country alone, we have a great Catholic school system, but more than 90% of those kids leave school and don't go to Mass. You would think that having such an infrastructure as your own school system would be a guaranteed way of regenerating your faith on a strong basis. It's not working.
So you believe that by a logically and scientifically based proof of the miracles of God, that this will regenerate faith?
With some people. I don't think for one moment that the world's going to turn on its axis and say, okay, now there's a God, because Mick told us. Some may be converted, some will at least open their hearts to the possibility that there is a God, and that He's a loving God. He's a God of love. And if I get that message through to a limited number of people, then I'll have done my job.
I'd like to look at another excerpt from Signs from God, and this is when you were interviewing Katia after the stigmata, and you believed that, Katia believed that Jesus was actually talking to you. This notion that you mentioned before of a God that intervenes in ways that can't be predicted, why would He, for instance, intervene for you, talk to you in that instance, or perhaps answer your prayer on the plane, but He wouldn't intervene perhaps to save children in Darfur? Why that?
He's not saving the children in Darfur for the same reason that He's allowed for 2,000 years all sorts of atrocities. Wars, famines, natural disasters, man's humanity against man, because He's allowed us to run our own world. And man's inhumanity to man is enormous. And Darfur is a great example. I've worked in the Sudan, as I was talking earlier, and I've seen it. But the Bible will also tell you that it's those poor who will, find themselves in heaven. It's those people who are treated in that manner who will come first.
Why reach out for you, though?
I don't know. Probably because He was making a statement. I mean, the very fact that He allowed the stigmata, for the first time ever, a stigmata, which I totally believe to be genuine, to be filmed, to give us the date and time to be there, to have it filmed, was so that the world could be reminded of what He gave us. His life. And He's our creator. He made us, and yet He let us treat Him as we did. And He wanted to remind us of that. And He knew there would be a large audience for that. It was actually 28 million that night in the United States, which is a pretty large audience to see an event like that. It touched a lot of people, and Jesus knew that it would. So maybe maybe that was part of it, but don't ask me to read His mind.
It did touch a lot of people, and none more so than you. As you said, it was profound for you. I want to show one last excerpt here. This is Mike's response to something that Katia said when she was talking to him. That's a remarkable question. And I look at that and I think, did you truly have an open mind at this point, or did you really want to believe?
No, I had a truly open mind. What inspired that thought to look at it was, one, that somebody thought they saw a light in editing. It hadn't occurred to me. No, I didn't have any belief in it. It was a matter of you investigate everything that anywhere you can investigate.
That was a very indistinct image. I mean, I looked at it and...
it proves nothing.
It's a very big leap, though, is it not, from the light... There was some trick of the light to, could this be Jesus Christ?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a fair question. What do you think? Could it be?
In a universe of possibilities, yes.
Yeah. So it was a fair question.
I think it's admirable, absolutely, what you're trying to discover for yourself and for other people. I wonder, though, which is why I was asking about your frame of mind, your desire to believe, why in these circumstances, with the stigmata, for instance, with Katia, which you absolutely believe to be real and you've overseen the verification of it, why not hand that over entirely to people that aren't carrying any of the religious or psychological baggage you're carrying? Why not hand it over entirely? I know that the American skeptic James Randi has a standing $1 million offer to anyone that can prove stigmata. Why not hand it over to, I don't know, a Swiss research and a German and an American research group?
James Randi is a phony. I mean, he forgets that he once named me Investigative Journalist of the Year and sent me a trophy.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I threw it away. I didn't take it seriously.
But, okay, put aside James Randi. Why not give it to somebody that's not carrying any strong religious belief to absolutely thoroughly
We were quite
investigate?
prepared to do that. But all the people who criticised us, not one person asked to see the footage, including all the footage that didn't go to air. Not one person asked to interview any witnesses. Not one critic made the slightest attempt at investigation. So now tell me who I hand it over to.
Your religiosity has changed over the last decade. Do you believe that you're still the same clear-minded man that you were at the height of your career?
Oh, I think much, much clearer. Because before I found God, I trusted in me. Yeah, that's pretty dangerous. You know, I was a bit of a loose cannon at times and not always the best person to give advice, least of all to myself. But I find now, if I really have a dilemma or can't work something out, then I put it in God's hands and I pray about it. And I find that assists me. I find I'm a more peaceful person, a more forgiving person. I think I've made a few improvements, or God has allowed me to make a few improvements.
Has this given your life purpose?
Absolutely. Where there was none apart from my family.
When you see people take God, their belief in God, perhaps God speaking to them, and use it as has happened historically and is happening again in the world today for violent ends, for aggressive ends, how do you reconcile that?
I can't, and it's not for me to reconcile. That's, again, free will.
That's a double bind, isn't it? It's God's will, but it's free will.
Yes, well, I can't explain that. Which is why I turn to God, because with God there are a lot of rational answers and there are a lot of answers that satisfy your heart. Without God, there aren't any answers.
I can't wait to read your book.
I'm not sure you're going to. At the start of the interview I thought you might, but...
What, you're not going to send me a copy anymore? You cheapskate!
Maybe I'll just photostat a couple of the relevant pages and send them over.
But are you surprised that I'm taking this line of questioning? Because I'm trying to ask rational questions in the same way that you are.
I said earlier in the interview that you won't find faith simply through rational thinking. It is a gift. I also said that if you want faith, all you have to do is open your heart. Say, at least recognise that God might be there. In the meantime, if you rely on your own rational thinking, then you're pretty well saying, I can outthink God and I'll decide for myself if he's there or not. And you can't outthink God. And if there's no God, don't bother thinking about it. It's all a waste of time.
Mike Willesee, I admire your questioning spirit. Thank you very much.